Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today at the Museum of Australian Democracy in Ballarat, one of the real crucibles of Australian national identity in the political sphere. My name is Tim Watts. I'm a member of Gellibrand and the Victorian convener of the LFAR Australian Republic Group. Proud to say that my electorate in 1999 voted yes, thanks to the advocacy of the then member Nicola Roxon. So it's a legacy that I'm trying to carry on in Parliament. In many respects, it's not an easy time to be a supporter of the Republican movement. Small gatherings like this around the country are continuing to keep the flame alive, but we have to be realistic and that we currently have a federal government that's slavishly devoted to the monarchy. And we have a government that's wedded to the absurd rituals and traditions of the British monarchy, bringing back knighthoods to the amusement of the Australian people. And we have a media that are obsessed with the celebrity of Wills and Kate, baby George, baby number 2, who I don't think has arrived yet. No. I can't say I follow the live updates, but I understand it's on the way. And a media devoting hundreds of articles in the Australian print media, even in the last month, to Kate's current pregnancy. Woman. And finally, we have a group of young Australians who are too young to remember the Republican movement of the 1990s and so aren't even aware of the possibility of being able to change our system of government. Just last week, I was speaking to a legal studies class in a high school in my electorate and felt more than a little bit old when it was pointed out to me that no one in the room had even been born at the time of the last referendum. So in the minds of these young people, this next generation, it really is history. We need to really work to sort of build that up again. So unsurprisingly, support amongst young Australians is at what I think is an all-time low. Given this, it may seem to be an odd moment to argue that we must begin the Republican debate anew now. But it's important to remember that a similarly desolate situation faced Republicans in the late 1980s. There was a similarly popular young princess, and 2 little princes that were gaining huge media attention. There was also lukewarm support throughout Australia for a republic. In opinion polls, support for the republic in the late 1980s hovered around 40%. In fact, a commission established by the Labor government to review the constitution in time for Australia's bicentenary in 1988 concluded that there was no effective republican movement in Australia. It argued that a referendum on the republic should not be held because, quote, on the evidence available to it, and regardless of the merits of the argument, there is no prospect of a change in public opinion in the near future which would result in there being a majority support for the Republic. In fact, the Commission believed that the Australian people favoured the monarchy so overwhelmingly that it wasn't even worth including a recommendation to proceed to pursue a referendum in future, as it would detract from other elements of the report. It wasn't even discussed. But just 10 years later, we were heading into a referendum with a majority of Australians supporting some sort of constitutional model, removing the Queen as our head of state and putting an Australian into the top job. So how did this happen? Like Matt, I'm a believer that we need to be talking more about process in this Republican debate. I'll get to some symbolism later, but process really matters about how we get from where we are now in rooms like this to a national campaign. So how did this happen in the 90s? Well, it was Republican activists that put the question on the agenda, forced the question onto the Australian agenda. In 1991, we saw the Constitutional Centenary Conference convened by legal experts from around the country. The conference aimed for a full and frank discussion of the parts of Australia's constitution that needed change, and its discussion of the constitutional mechanics needed to put a republic into place began the process of raising awareness of the Republican cause, in much the same way as Daniel's intending the discussion was today. The conference also led to the creation of the Constitutional Centenary Foundation, an invaluable source of impartial legal advice on the Republic as the debate gained momentum. 1991 saw the creation of the Australian Republican movement. The activists of the ARM were able to work with the Keating government to further awareness of the need for the Republic. By February 1993, Prime Minister Keating was ready to announce the formation of a committee to analyse potential forms for an Australian Republic. It was a long journey, however, from this moment to counting votes on referendum day almost a decade later. The formal process to determine whether Australians wanted to become a republic at that time was complex. It started with the investigation and report of the Australian Republican Advisory Committee into potential options for a republic in 1993. In 95, there was the commitment by the Keating government to pursue a republic by 2001, the centenary of federation, but it took until 1997 to pass the legislation establishing the Constitutional Convention. Another year in order to hold the convention, and finally, in November 1999, before the referendum was held. Yet throughout this period, Republican activists were working hard to find grassroots support, and they were succeeding. During this period, support for a republic shot up from 40% of the late 1980s to 60% in 1994 and 66% in 1996, a level where it remained until John Howard's bastardry in the lead up to the referendum. Of course, this process wasn't perfect, to say the least, and there are many disappointed Republicans on referendum night. Let's not forget, though, that support for a republic survived the referendum loss, and even in 2004, in the depths of the Howard years, it stood at a strong 57%. We can take away from the 99 referendum two important things. First, it takes Republican activists to spur on debate. Activists need to be engaged with Australians to convince them of the need for a republic, not the other way around, not waiting for the public to come to our point of view. And second, that the timeframes for referenda are significant. It took almost a decade to cover all the legal and political considerations of such an important constitutional change to get the people on board. So this brings me to the second part of my speech today, about why the time for a republic conversation to begin anew is now. If you look back in Australia of the 1990s, when the republic process began, you could already see that it was a very different country from the one that enshrined the Queen as our head of state at Federation. What's become increasingly clear in the 20 years since is that this gap has only widened. The multicultural policy reforms of the Fraser, Hawke, Keating and Whitlam governments have had taken time to take root. The result is that we've evolved into a multicultural and largely racially tolerant society. A society for which social commentator Hugh Mackay has rightly noted that the defining characteristic is diversity itself. In fact, in 2010, China surpassed the United Kingdom as the largest source of permanent migrants to Australia, with barely a murmur of controversy, barely a mention in the press, an event that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. You can only imagine how Pauline Hanson would have responded to this in the mid-90s. What can we say of Australia in a further 20 years' time? What will the relevance of the UK monarch be by then? The time to start building momentum for change in this time is now. We know that the movement will take years to result in lasting change. We know that it takes Republican activists to drive support for the movement, and that public awareness doesn't come overnight. Considering significant constitutional and political change requires long-term planning, which should not be affected by current circumstances or national mood. The weather at the bottom of the mountain shouldn't stop you from starting a journey. People may love the Royals now, but who knows where Wills and Kate will be in 10 years' time? Who knows who the British monarch will be? Who knows where we as a nation will be? We need to start asking questions, forming the committees and talking to the Australian people to explore how the Australian moods change and what sort of a republic they would support. We also need to start building with grassroots support, particularly amongst the young, and we need to start now. I think that it's important that the Labor Party leads this debate. Within the Labor Party, since the failure of the 1999 referendum, there's been a school of thought within some that this is an issue for quite the elites. That would show Labor to be out of touch with the opinion of the general public if we chose to pursue it. For decades, there's been a sensitivity in the Republican movement about the need to be bipartisan when talking about the Republic, for fear that a referendum that wasn't supported by both sides of politics would be doomed to fail. Well, I disagree with both of those perspectives. My view is that the Republican movement needs Labor, and Labor needs the Republic. From Labor's perspective, we can make the Republic a vote-winning issue for us, if we aren't afraid about being bold about our vision for Australia's identity. Conservatives and reactionaries like our Prime Minister like to suggest that Australian identity is somehow immutable, and that the concept of what an Australian is somehow carved in stone by Henry Parkes and other people with long beards at the time of Federation. But no one here should be under any illusions. National identity is politically constructed. John Howard understood that. It's time we did. Edmund Barton, the country's first Prime Minister, may well have proclaimed that, quote, Australia is a nation for a continent for a nation. But as a people, we are not defined by our geography. We've been defined by a national identity that we've built for ourselves. A national identity that has changed dramatically over the past 120 years. To see how national identity is politically constructed, consider how just a few of our national symbols have evolved since Federation. Our flag is a powerful symbol of national identity. Its place in the Australian consciousness is now so strong that to many it feels like an unchangeable part of our national identity. But if you look at Tom Roberts' iconic big picture portrait of the opening of the first Commonwealth Parliament in Melbourne in 1901, you'll see three flags in use: the Union Jack, the red ensign, and the blue ensign that we today recognise as the Australian flag. Throughout the early years of our nation, there was confusion over who was permitted to fly which flag and what it could be called when it was being flown. As a result, the Australian red ensign was commonly flown by Australians until 1953, when Prime Minister Menzies passed the Flags Act and made the blue ensign the national standard. An act that I should say he took without consulting the public and did throughout the Parliament, only to have John Howard subsequently pass the Flags Act, ostensibly requiring a referendum in order to change it. It's notable that our conception of something as seemingly unchanging and fundamental as Australia's flag has actually changed substantially over the past 100 years. The concept of citizenship too, the right to be a full participant in our community and our democracy, has changed significantly over time as well. In 1901, at the same time as the Federation Parliament, down the road from the opening of that Federation, the first meeting of the Federation Parliament in Melbourne's Exhibition Building, in Little Bourke Street, in Chinatown, as it was then, as it is now, there was a celebration to mark the presence of the Duke and Duchess of York, who were in Australia to mark the opening of the Federation Parliament. The Chinese traders of Little Bourke Street decorated Swanston Street with flags and lanterns and a Chinese arch with two pagoda-style towers adorned with a banner for the royal party that read, "Welcome by the Chinese citizens." Unfortunately, despite their obvious civic pride, this banner was erected more in hope than in truth, as at the time, the vast majority of Chinese Australians were not Chinese citizens. Before Federation, most Australian colonies passed laws banning Asians from being naturalised in Australia, and despite the presence of this civically minded Australian community at the opening of Parliament, just 9 days after the opening of the Federation Parliament, the Immigration Restriction Act, better known as the White Australia Policy, was introduced into Parliament. Timothy Kendall, as an academic who's written an excellent monograph on this period, and he wrote that, quote, "Federation was a moment of self-determination which presented a new nation with a new, unique opportunity to reflect on matters of identity, citizenship and nationhood. The first Parliament of Australia drew on this opportunity, this moment of sovereignty, to construct deliberately discriminatory and racially exclusive legislation." I should add a personal note to this story, that my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandfather, was a member of the first Queensland Parliament. That was a Parliament that passed anti-miscegenation laws. It was a Parliament that passed the kind of laws that were enshrined federally in the Immigration Restriction Act. When I was elected into Parliament, my family were there for my first speech. My wife, who immigrated to Australia from China when she was 10 years old. My children, who are both 7th and 2nd generation Australians, were in the gallery. And it certainly was in my consciousness the fact that 120 years ago, or significantly more, 140 years ago, my ancestor was passing laws intended to define the Australian identity that deliberately excluded my family today. I tell that story with optimism. I think that's a great story because it shows how far we've come as a country, how different we are today, how much better we are as a people since the days of Edmund Barton and Henry Parkes. And my view is that Labor needs to confidently assert that the ethnically and culturally diverse Australia of today looks very different from the official White Australia of Federation. We need to challenge the Conservatives and ask them directly whether or not this is for the better, and whether the Australia at the start of the 21st century is not a far greater nation than the Australia at the start of the 20th. We need to ask them whether they are proud of how far we've come as a nation since the days of Edmund Barton. And we should ask them if they can recognise that our nation has changed, and changed for the better, then we should also recognise that the symbols of our nation that have become outdated as a result of this change should also change. The British monarch is no longer a single thread that unites us as a nation, as Henry Parkes said in his field oration. It is at best an irrelevance, and at worst a symbol of our inability as a nation to recognise who we really are and who we have become. This is uncomfortable terrain for Conservatives, and terrain that Labor has won political contests on in the past. I'm sure that most of you would know that the words to our national anthem, first two verses at least, and that our national flower is the wattle, and that our national colours are green and gold. But fewer remember that the national anthem was only formalised in 1984 by a Labor government, that our national flower was classified in 1988, and it was only in 1984 that we certified our love of green and gold, all popular political actions by Labor governments. We can win a political debate in Australia about Australia's national identity because we are closer to modern Australia than the Tories are. Like modern Australians in general, we're diverse, open and optimistic. There are a few issues that would highlight just how disconnected Tony Abbott is from the country that we have become than a debate about the Republic. If Tony Abbott wants to defend knights and dames and kings and queens in modern Australia, then this is a political fight that Labor ought to give him. We shouldn't be afraid of patriotism and worry that it's somehow distraction from the bread and butter issues of our cause. Symbols matter, and national symbols matter a great deal. Our national symbols matter to the sense of connection that Australian citizens feel with other Australians and their nation and their government. It matters whether Australians feel like they share a common stake in the hopes and achievements of their fellow citizens, and it matters that people feel that we are all in the same boat. Labor believes in the potential for what we can achieve together and the power of collective action. Too often, progressives discount the important role that a sense of unified national identity can play as an enabler of collective action. Think of the things that we have built in this nation through a sense of shared endeavour. As Tim Soutphommasane has argued in his book Reclaiming Patriotism, progressives, people who believe in the potential for change through collective action, should readily embrace the label patriot. Soutphommasane argues that a love for country and a national identity also includes an obligation to improve our country in any possible way, to engage in nation building. It's progressives who have been the instigators of the major nation building initiatives that have made our country great. They have been the ones pushing the nation building reforms like the Snowy Mountain Hydroelectric Scheme, Medicare, Australia's Superannuation Savings Scheme. From the perspective of the Republican movement, the Republic won't get off the ground unless the Labor Party is leading it. We're the party of change in this nation, and the obligation falls to us. We're the only party with a proven record, not just of reflecting public opinion, but leading it. If we wait for a Liberal government to lead us to a republic, we'll be waiting until the bicentenary of federation. So I congratulate all of you for being a part of this and for being in this room today. And I thank Daniel and the other members of the Labor for Australian Republic group for keeping the embers of the Republic alive in these difficult times. Thank you.